Hi guys, let's start part 2 of chapter number 2, that is the Socialism in Europe and the Russian Revolution. The February Revolution in Petrograd. In the winter of 1917, conditions in the capital Petrograd were grim. The layout of the city seemed to emphasize the divisions among its people. The workers' quarters and factories were located on the right bank of the river Neva. So, on the right bank of the river Neva, the workers' quarters and the factories are located. And on the left bank, where the fashionable areas, the Winter Palace, and official buildings, including the palace where the Duma met. In February 1917, food shortages were deeply felt in the workers' quarters. The winter was very cold. There had been exceptional frost and heavy snow. Parliamentarians wishing to preserve elected government were opposed to the Tsar's desire to dissolve the Duma. On 22nd February, a lockout took place at a factory on the right bank. So the factories are located on the right bank. The next day, workers in 50 factories called a strike in sympathy. In many factories, women led the way to strikes. This came to be called the International Women's Day. Demonstrating workers crossed from the factory quarters to the center of the capital, the Nevsky Prospect. At this stage, no political party was actively organizing the movement. As the fashionable quarters and official buildings were surrounded by workers, the government imposed a curfew. Demonstrators dispersed by the evening, but they came back on the 24th and 25th. The government called out the cavalry and police to keep an eye on them. On Sunday, 25th February, the government suspended the Duma. Politicians spoke out against the measure. Demonstrators returned in force to the streets of the left bank on the 26th. On the 27th, the police headquarters were ransacked. The streets thronged with people raising slogans about bread, wages, better hours, and democracy. The government tried to control the situation and called out the cavalry once again. However, the cavalry refused to fire on the demonstrators. An officer was shot at the barracks of a regiment, and 3 other regiments mutinied, voting to join the striking workers. We have figure 8, the Petrograd Soviet meeting in the Duma, February 1917. By that evening, soldiers and striking workers had gathered to form a Soviet or council in the same building as the Duma met. This was the Petrograd Soviet. So this is called as the Petrograd Soviet. The very next day, a delegation went to see the Tsar. Military commanders advised him to abdicate. He followed their advice and abdicated on 2nd March. Soviet leaders and Duma leaders formed a provisional government to run the country. So the Soviet leaders and the Duma leaders, they come together and they formed the provisional government and they run the country. Russia's future would be decided by a constituent assembly. elected on the basis of universal adult suffrage. Petrograd had led the February Revolution that brought down the monarchy in February 1917. So, February Revolution, it occurred in the year 1917. Women in the February Revolution. Women workers often inspired their male co-workers at the Lawrence telephone factory. Marfa Vasileva almost single-handedly called a successful strike. Already that morning, in celebration of Women's Day, women workers had presented red bows to the men. Then Marfa Vasileva, a milling machine operator. So she was a milling machine operator, and she stopped work and declared an impromptu strike. The workers on the floor were ready to support her. The foreman informed the management and sent her a loaf of bread. She took the bread but refused to go back to work. The administrator asked her again why she refused to work, and she replied, "I cannot be the only one who is satiated when others are hungry." Satiated, it means satisfy a desire or an appetite. Women workers from another section of the factory gathered around Marfa in support, and gradually all the other women ceased working. Soon the men downed their tools as well, and the entire crowd rushed into the street. 3.1 After February, Army officials, land owners, and industrialists were influential in the provincial government. Okay, in the provisional government. So, in the provisional government, the army officials, landowners, and the industrialists, they were very influential. But the liberals as well as socialists among them worked towards and elected government. But the liberals and the socialists, what they wanted was an elected government. Restrictions on public meetings and associations were removed. Soviets like the Petrograd Soviet were set up everywhere, though no common system of election was followed. In April 1917, the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia from his exile. He and the Bolsheviks had opposed the war since 1914. Now he felt it was time for Soviets to take over power. He declared that the war be brought to a close, land be transferred to the peasants, and banks be nationalized. These three demands were Lenin's April theses. So, what are the Lenin's April theses? Number 1, the end of war. Number 2, land be transferred to the peasants. Number 3, banks be nationalized. He also argued that the Bolshevik Party rename itself the Communist Party to indicate its new radical aims. So he also wanted the Bolshevik Party to get it renamed into Communist Party. Most others in the Bolshevik Party were initially surprised by the April theses. They thought that the time was not yet ripe for a socialist revolution, and the provisional government needed to be supported. But the developments of the subsequent months changed their attitude. Through the summer, the workers' movement spread. In industrial areas, factory committees were formed, which began questioning the way industrialists ran their factories. Trade unions grew in number. Soldiers' committees were formed in the army. In June, about 500 Soviets sent representatives to an all Russian Congress of Soviets. As the provisional government saw its power reduce and Bolshevik influence grow, it decided to take stern measures against the spreading discontent. It resisted attempts by workers to run factories and began arresting leaders. Popular demonstrations staged by the Bolsheviks in July 1917 were sternly repressed. Many Bolshevik leaders had to go into hiding or flee. So we have a figure here, figure 9, a Bolshevik image of Lenin addressing workers in April 1917. Meanwhile, in the countryside, peasants and their socialist revolutionary leaders pressed for a redistribution of land. Land committees were formed to handle this. Encouraged by the socialist revolutionaries, peasants seized land between July and September 1917. Here's a figure. Figure 10, the July Days. A pro-Bolshevik demonstration on 7th July 1917 being fired upon by the army. 3.2 The Revolution of October 1917. As the conflict between the provisional government and the Bolsheviks grew, Lenin feared the provisional government would set up a dictatorship. In September, he began discussions for an uprising against the government. Bolshevik supporters in the army, Soviets, and factories were brought together. On 16th October 1917, Lenin persuaded the Petrograd Soviet and the Bolshevik Party to agree to a socialist seizure of power. A military revolutionary committee was appointed by the Soviet under Leon Trotsky to organize the seizure. The date of the event was kept a secret. Box 2. Death of the Russian Revolution. Russia followed the Julian calendar until 1st February 1918. So Russia followed the Julian calendar until 1st February 1918. The country then changed to the Gregorian calendar, which is followed everywhere today. The Gregorian dates are 13 days ahead of the Julian dates. So, by our calendar, the February Revolution took place on 12th March and the October Revolution took place on 7th November. Some important dates: 1850s to 1880s, debates over socialism in Russia. 1898, formation of the Russian Socialist Democratic Workers' Party. 1905, the Bloody Sunday and the Revolution of 1905. 1917, 2nd March, abdication of the Tsar. 24th October, Bolshevik uprising in Petrograd. 1918 to 1920, the Civil War. 1919, formation of Comintern. 1929, beginning of collectivization. The uprising began on 24th October. Sensing trouble, Prime Minister Kerensky had left the city to summon troops. At dawn, military men loyal to the government seized the buildings of two Bolshevik newspapers. Pro-government troops were sent to take over telephone and telegraph offices and protect the Winter Palace. In a swift response, the Military Revolutionary Committee ordered its supporters to seize government offices and arrest ministers. Late in the day, the ship Aurora shelled the winter capital. Other vessels sailed down the Neva and took over various military points. By nightfall, the city was under the committee's control and the ministers had surrendered. At a meeting of the All Russian Congress of Soviets in Petrograd, the majority approved the Bolshevik action. Uprisings took place in other cities. There was heavy fighting, especially in Moscow, but by December the Bolsheviks controlled the Moscow-Petrograd area. We have a figure 11. Lenin, it's on the left side, and Trotsky on the right, with workers at Petrograd. What changed after October? The Bolsheviks were totally opposed to private property. Most industry and banks were nationalized in November 1917. This meant that the government took over ownership and management. Land was declared social property and peasants were allowed to seize the land of the nobility. In cities, Bolsheviks enforced the partition of large houses according to family requirements. They banned the use of the old titles of aristocracy. To assert the change, new uniforms were designed for the army and officials. Following a clothing competition organized in 1918 when the Soviet hat Budyonovka was chosen. So we have a figure here, figure 12, a soldier wearing the Soviet hat, Budyonovka. The Bolshevik Party was renamed the Russian Communist Party, Bolshevik. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks conducted the elections to the Constituent Assembly, but they failed to gain majority support. In January 1918, the Assembly rejected Bolshevik measures and Lenin dismissed the Assembly. He thought the All-Russian Congress of Soviets was more democratic than an assembly elected in uncertain conditions. In March 1918, despite opposition by their political allies, the Bolsheviks made peace with Germany at Brest-Litovsk. In the years that followed, the Bolsheviks became the only party to participate in the election to the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which became the parliament of the country. So the parliament is the All-Russian Congress of Soviets. Russia became a one-party state. Trade unions were kept under party control. The secret office called the Cheka first and later OGPU and NKVD punished those who criticized the Bolsheviks. Many young writers and artists rallied to the party because it stood for socialism and for change. After October 1917, this led to experiments in the arts and architecture, but many became disillusioned because of the censorship the party encouraged. Figure 13, May Day, demonstration in Moscow in 1918. Then we have box 3, the October Revolution and the Russian countryside, two views. So the first view, news of the revolutionary uprising of October 25, 1917 reached the village the following day and was greeted with enthusiasm. To the peasants it meant free land and an end to the war. The day the news arrived, the landowner's manor house was looted, his stock farms were requisitioned, and his vast orchard was cut down and sold to the peasants for wood. All his far buildings were torn down and left in ruins while the land was distributed among the peasants who were prepared to live the new Soviet life. A member of a landowning family wrote to a relative about what happened at the estate. The coup happened quite painlessly, quietly and peacefully. The first days were unbearable. Mikhail Mikhailovich, the estate owner, was calm. The girls also. I must say the chairman behaves correctly and even politely. We were left 2 cows and 2 horses. The servants tell them all the time not to bother us. Let them live. We vouch for their safety and property. We want them treated as humanly as possible. There are rumors that several villages are trying to evict the committees and return the estate to Mikhail Mikhailovich. I don't know if this will happen or if it's good for us, but we rejoice that there is a conscience in our people. 4.1 The Civil War. When the Bolshevik ordered land distribution, the Russian army began to break up. Soldiers, mostly peasants, wished to go home for the redistribution and deserted. Non-Bolshevik socialists, liberals, and supporters of autocracy condemned the Bolshevik uprising. Their leaders moved to South Russia and organized troops to fight the Bolsheviks, that is the Reds. During 1918 and 1919, the Greens, Socialist revolutionaries, and Whites, pro-Tsarist, controlled most of the Russian Empire. So the Reds, it means Bolsheviks, the Greens, they are the Socialist revolutionaries, and the Whites, they are the pro-Tsarist. They were backed by French, American, British, and Japanese troops. All those forces who were worried at the growth of socialism in Russia. So these countries, they were against the Bolshevik. As these troops and the Bolshevik fought a civil war, looting, banditry, and famine became common. Supporters of private property among whites took harsh steps with peasants who had seized land. Such actions led to the loss of popular support for the non-Bolsheviks. By January 1920, the Bolsheviks controlled most of the former Russian Empire. They succeeded due to cooperation with non-Russian nationalities and Muslim Jadidis. Cooperation did not work where Russian colonies themselves turned Bolshevik. So what happened was that by January 1920, the Bolsheviks controlled most of the former Russian Empire, and they succeeded. Why? Due to the cooperation with non-Russian nationalists. nationalities, and Muslim jihadists. Cooperation did not work where Russian colonists themselves turned Bolshevik. In Khiva, in Central Asia, Bolshevik colonists brutally massacred local nationalists in the name of defending socialism. So, what happened in Khiva was that the Bolshevik colonists they brutally massacred local nationalists in the name of defending socialism. In this situation, many were confused about what the Bolshevik government represented. Partly to remedy this, most non Russian nationalities were given political autonomy in the Soviet Union, USSR, the state the Bolsheviks created from the Russian Empire in December 1922. So, autonomy, the right to govern themselves. But since this was combined with unpopular policies that the Bolsheviks forced the local government to follow, like the harsh discouragement of nomadism, attempts to win over different nationalities were only partly successful. So, nomadism, lifestyle of those who do not live in one place but move from area to area to earn their living. Source B. Central Asia of the October Revolution. We have got two views. So, the first view, M.N. Roy was an Indian revolutionary, a founder of the Mexican Communist Party, and prominent Comintern leader in India, China, and Europe. He was in Central Asia at the time of the Civil War in the 1920s. He wrote, "The chieftain was a benevolent old man. His attendant, a youth who spoke Russian. He had heard of the revolution which had overthrown the Tsar and driven away the generals who conquered the homeland of the Kyrgyz. So the revolution meant that the Kyrgyz were masters of their home again. Long live the revolution, shouted the Kyrgyz youth, who seemed to be a born Bolshevik. The whole tribe joined." And the second view. The Kyrgyz welcomed the first revolution, that is the February Revolution, with joy, and the second revolution with consternation and terror. This first revolution freed them from the oppression of the Tsarist regime and strengthened their hope that autonomy would be realized. The second revolution, that is the October Revolution, was accompanied by violence, pillage, taxes, and the establishment of dictatorial power. Once a small group of Tsarist bureaucrats oppressed the Kyrgyz. Now the same group of people perpetuate the same regime. 4.2 Making a Socialist Society. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks kept industries and banks nationalized. They permitted peasants to cultivate the land that had been socialized. Bolsheviks used confiscated land to demonstrate what collective work could be. A process of centralized planning was introduced. Officials assessed how the economy could work and set targets for a 5-year period. On this basis, they made the 5-year plans. The government fixed all prices to promote industrial growth during the first two plans. And the first two plants are in the year 1927 to 1932 and 1933 to 1938. So, box 4, Socialist cultivation in a village in the Ukraine. A commune was set up using two confiscated farms as a base. The commune consisted of 13 families with a total of 70 persons. The farm tools taken from the farms were turned over to the commune. The members ate in a communal dining hall, and income was divided in accordance with the principles of cooperative communism. The entire proceeds of the members' labor, as well as all dwellings and facilities belonging to the commune, were shared by the commune members. Centralized planning led to economic growth. Industrial production increased between 1929 and 1933 by 100% in the case of oil, coal, and steel. New factory cities came into being. However, rapid construction led to poor working conditions. In the city of Magnitogorsk, the construction of a steel plant was achieved in 3 years. Workers lived hard lives, and the result was 550 stoppages of work in the first year alone. In living quarters in the winter time at 40 degrees below, people had to climb down from the fourth floor and dash across the street in order to go to the toilet. An extended schooling system developed, and arrangements were made for factory workers and peasants to enter universities. Creches were established in factories for the children of women workers. Cheap public health care was provided. Model living quarters were set up for workers. The effect of all this was uneven, though since government resources were limited. So we have figure 14. Factories came to be seen as a symbol of socialism. This poster states the smoke from the chimneys is the breathing of Soviet Russia. Figure 13. Children at school in Soviet Russia in the 1930s. They are studying the Soviet economy. Figure 16. A child in Magnitogorsk during the first 5-year plan. He is working for Soviet Russia. Figure 17. Factory dining hall in the 1930s. Source C. Dreams and realities of the Soviet childhood in 1933. Dear grandfather Kalinin, my family is large. There are 4 children. We don't have a father. He died fighting for the workers' cause, and my mother is ailing. I want to study very much, but I cannot go to school. I had some old boots, but they are completely torn and no one can mend them. My mother is sick. We have no money and no bread, but I want to study very much. There stands before us the task of studying, studying, and studying. That is what Vladimir Ilyich Lenin said. But I have to stop going to school. We have no relatives and there is no one to help us. So I have to go to work in a factory to prevent the family from starving. Dear grandfather, I am 13. I study well and have no bad reports. I am in class 5. Letter of 1933 from a 13-year-old worker to Kalinin, Soviet President. 4.3 Stalinism and Collectivization. The period of the early planned economy was linked to the disasters of the collectivization of agriculture. By 1927-1928, the towns in Soviet Russia were facing an acute problem of grain supplies. The government fixed prices at which grain must be sold, but the peasants refused to sell their grain to government buyers at these prices. Stalin, who headed the party after the death of Lenin, introduced firm emergency measures. He believed that rich peasants and traders in the countryside were holding stocks in the hope of higher prices. Speculation had to be stopped and supplies confiscated. In 1928, party members toured the grain producing areas, supervising enforced grain collections and raiding kulaks, the name for well-to-do peasants. As shortages continued, the decision was taken to collectivize farms. It was argued that grain shortages were partly due to the small size of holdings. After 1917, land had been given over to peasants. These small sized peasant farms could not be modernized. To develop modern farms and run them along industrial lines with machinery, it was necessary to eliminate kulaks, take away land from peasants, and establish state controlled large farms. Figure 18. A poster during collectivization. It states, "We shall strike at the kulak working for the decrease in cultivation." What followed was Stalin's collectivization program. From 1929, the party forced all peasants to cultivate in collective farms, kolkhoz. The bulk of land and implements were transferred to the ownership of collective farms. Peasants worked on the land, and the kolkhoz profit was shared. Enraged peasants resisted the authorities and destroyed their livestock. Between 1929 and 1931, the number of cattle fell by one-third. Those who resisted collectivization were severely punished. Many were deported and exiled. As they resisted collectivization, peasants argued that they were not rich and they were not against socialism. They merely did not want to work in collective farms for a variety of reasons. Stalin's government allowed some independent cultivation, but treated such cultivators unsympathetically. In spite of collectivization, production did not increase immediately. In fact, the bad harvest of 1930 to 1933 led to one of the most devastating famines in Soviet history, when over 4 million died. So deported, it means forcibly removed from one's own country. Exiled, it means forced to live away from one's own country. We have figure 19. Peasant women being gathered to work in the large collective farms. Source D. Official view of the opposition to collectivization and the government response. From the second half of February of this year, in various regions of the Ukraine, mass insurrections of the peasantry have taken place, caused by distortions of the party's line by a section of the lower ranks of the party and the Soviet apparatus in the course of the introduction of collectivization and preparatory work for the spring harvest. Within a short time, large scale activities from the above mentioned regions carried over into neighboring areas, and the most aggressive insurrections have taken place near the border. The greater part of the peasant insurrections have been linked with outright demands for the return of collectivized stocks of grain, livestock, and tools. Between 1st February and 15th March, 25,000 have been arrested, 656 have been executed, 3,673 have been imprisoned in labor camps, and 5,580 exiled. Report of K.M. Carlson, President of the State Police Administration of the Ukraine, to the Central Committee of the Communist Party on 19th March 1930. Many within the party criticized the confusion in industrial production under the planned economy and the consequences of collectivization. Stalin and his sympathizers charged these critics with conspiracy against socialism. Accusations were made throughout the country, and by 1939 over 2 million were in prisons or labor camps. Most were innocent of the crimes, but no one spoke for them. A large number were forced to make false confessions under torture and were executed. Several among them were talented professionals. We have source E. This is the letter written by a peasant who did not want to join the collective farm to the newspaper, peasant newspaper. I am a natural working peasant born in 1879. There are 6 members in my family. My wife was born in 1881. My son is 16, 2 daughters 19. All 3 go to school. My sister is 71. From 1932, heavy taxes have been levied on me that I have found impossible. From 1935, local authorities have increased the taxes on me, and I was unable to handle them, and all my property was registered. My horse, cow, calf, sheep with lambs, all my implements, furniture, and my reserve of wood for repair of buildings, and they sold the lot for the taxes. In 1936, they sold 2 of my buildings. The kolkhoz bought them. In 1937, of 2 huts I had, one was sold and one was confiscated. 5. The global influence of the Russian Revolution and the USSR. Existing socialist parties in Europe did not wholly approve of the way the Bolsheviks took power and kept it. However, the possibility of a workers' state fired people's imagination across the world. In many countries, communist parties were formed, like the Communist Party of Great Britain. The Bolsheviks encouraged colonial peoples to follow their experiment. Many non-Russians from outside the USSR participated in the Conference of the Peoples of the East, 1920, and the Bolshevik founded Comintern, and International Union of Pro-Bolshevik Socialist Parties. Some received education in the USSR's Communist University of the Workers of the East. By the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, the USSR had given socialism a global face and world stature. Yet, by the 1950s, it was acknowledged within the country that the style of government in the USSR was not in keeping with the ideals of the Russian Revolution. In the world socialist movement too, it was recognized that all was not well in the Soviet Union. So, in the world socialist movement too, it was recognized that all was not well in the Soviet Union. A backward country had become a great power. Its industries and agriculture had developed, and the poor were being fed. But it had denied the essential freedoms to its citizens and carried out its developmental projects through repressive policies. By the end of the 20th century, the international reputation of the USSR as a socialist country had declined, though it was recognized that socialist ideals still enjoyed respect among its people. But in each country, the ideas of socialism were rethought in a variety of different ways. Box 5. Writing about the Russian Revolution in India. Among those the Russian Revolution inspired were many Indians. Several attended the Communist University. By the mid-1920s, the Communist Party was formed in India. Its members kept in touch with the Soviet Communist Party. Important Indian political and cultural figures took an interest in the Soviet experiment and visited Russia. Among them, Jawaharlal Nehru and Rabindranath Tagore, who wrote about Soviet socialism. In India, writings gave impressions of Soviet Russia. In Hindi, R.S. Avasthi wrote in 1920-21 Russian Revolution, Lenin, his life and his thoughts, and later the Red Revolution. S.D. Vidyalankar wrote The Rebirth of Russia and the Soviet State of Russia. There was much that was written in Bengali, Marathi, Malayalam, Tamil, and Telugu. Figure 20. Special issue on Lenin of the Indo-Soviet Journal. Indian Communist mobilized support for the USSR during the Second World War. We have another source. And Indian arrives in Soviet Russia in 1920. For the first time in our lives, we were seeing Europeans mixing freely with Asians. On seeing the Russians mingling freely with the rest of the people of the country, we were convinced that we had come to a land of real equality. We saw freedom in its true light. In spite of their poverty, imposed by the counter-revolutionaries and the imperialists, the people were more jovial and satisfied than ever before. The revolution had instilled confidence and fearlessness in them. The real brotherhood of mankind would be seen here among these people of 50 different nationalities. No barriers of caste or religion hindered them from mixing freely with one another. Every soul was transformed into an orator. One could see a worker, a peasant, or a soldier haranguing like a professional lecturer. Source G. Rabindranath Tagore wrote from Russia in 1930. Moscow appears much less clean than the other European capitals. None of those hurrying along the streets look smart. The whole place belongs to the workers. Here the masses have not in the least been put in the shade by the gentlemen. Those who lived in the background for years have come forward in the open today. I thought of the peasants and workers in my own country. It all seemed like the work of the genie in the Arabian Nights. Here only a decade ago they were an illiterate, helpless, and hungry as our own masses. Who could be more astonished than an unfortunate Indian like myself to see how they had removed the mountain of ignorance and helplessness in these few years? So that's all, guys. See you in my next video. Bye.